The golden ram on top of the Bowser, lit up at dusk on the Hume Highway, lit up at dusk on the Newell, lit up at dusk on the Sturt. Every servo from Coffs Harbour to Codjuna, every roadhouse from Burke to Broken Hill. The last thing you saw before the desert started. 5,000 of them across a continent. And then, in the year 1888, a sick English boy from Bristol arrived in Melbourne with weak lungs and no money. And he became the man who put that ram on every highway in this country. And his own grandson sold the whole empire to the Americans in March 1981 for $75 million. Less than a year later, the golden ram started coming down. One servo at a time, town by town, almost every one of them. And Australia has never built another petrol brand of its own since. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Sick Boy from Bristol. The story doesn't start in Melbourne. It doesn't start with a Bowser. It doesn't start with a ram. It starts in a comfortable brick house in Gloucestershire in 1867 with a sickly child who could not survive an English winter. Harold Crofton Sleigh was born on the 19th of May, 1867, at Westbury-on-Trim, a suburb of Bristol on the western edge of England. His father, Hamilton Norman Sleigh, was a maltster, a man who turned barley into malt for the Bristol breweries. His mother was Anna Elizabeth, born Ward. They lived at Belmont House in the village of Bitton in Gloucestershire, comfortable but not wealthy. He was a sickly child. He went to Bath Grammar School, then took a clerk's position at the Bristol Joint Stock Bank. From there, he moved to the Union Bank of London, where he learned the paperwork of international shipping, bills of lading, letters of credit, freight manifests, the whole architecture of the British Empire's cargo trade. He was good at it. He was also constantly ill. Here's the thing about Harold Sleigh. He was never physically strong. In his early 20s, the doctors in London told him he had to get out. His lungs could not take another English winter. He went back to Bristol. He recuperated at Belmont House. He took a long ocean voyage to the Black Sea, breathing salt air, watching the coastline of the Ottoman Empire drift past his cabin window. When he came home, he made a decision. He would migrate to Australia. For his health. Read that phrase again. For his health. Australia in the 1880s was not a health resort. It was a colonial outpost, 13,000 miles from London. But the doctors told Harold Sleigh that the dry inland heat and the sea air of the southern hemisphere were his only chance. Passenger ships in 1888 took 3 months from Southampton to Melbourne, and the mortality rate for consumptive travellers was measurable. He arrived in 1888. He was 21 years old. He had a suitcase, a bank clerk's handwriting, £4 to his name, and a chest that could not survive another Bristol fog. Stand on the deck of a migrant ship, arriving at Port Melbourne in that year. Look at what he saw. A colonial city built on gold, wool and wheat. A harbour full of masts, warehouses along the wharves, the smoke of the Newport locomotive workshops rising over the western suburbs, and beyond all of it, a country with no petrol industry, no oil industry, and no idea that within 30 years the man on the deck of that ship would invent both. Within 7 years, the sick boy from Bristol would own barges on the Murray. Within 25 years, he would accidentally invent Australia's petrol industry. Chapter 2. Barges on the Murray. Harold Sleigh did not have money. What he had was the paperwork education of a London banker and the willingness to work in places nobody else wanted to work. He went to Orange, in the central west of New South Wales. He worked whatever came up, and then in 1891, in partnership with another young man, He bought a steamer called the Emu and started running cargo up and down the Murray and Darling rivers out of Bourke. Read that again. A 24-year-old English bank clerk with weak lungs is running paddle steamers on the Darling River. The Emu. Then another one called the Ethel Jackson. Wool going downstream to the ports. Flour and hardware going back up. Bourke in the summer heat. By 1893, he was back in Melbourne working for a firm of shipbrokers called Harold Brothers. He learned who chartered what, who paid on time, who did not, and where the money in colonial shipping actually sat. Then he resigned and privately tendered for a coal contract with the Western Australian Government Railways. He won it. Nobody had expected him to. On the 5th of June 1895, at St John's Church in Melbourne, he married Marion Elizabeth Chappell. 5 months later, in November of that year, he formed a business partnership with a Melbourne manufacturer and ship owner named John McElwraith. The two men opened an office in Flinders Street. They called it the Blue Star Line. They ran ships to New Zealand, to South Africa, to the Pacific. In 1899, Harold Sleigh pioneered the live sheep export trade to South Africa, buying merinos on the Riverina and shipping them across the Indian Ocean. In 1902, backed by a £30,000 subsidy from the New Zealand government, he floated the Colonial Steamship Company on the London Stock Exchange. By the mid-1920s, he held the Northern Territory coastal shipping contract, running supply vessels from Darwin to Broome. Coal, timber, wheat, flour, butter, beef, tallow, fruit, sandalwood, out of Western Australia. He traded all of it. He was Melbourne's quiet millionaire, an Anglican, with a Bristol accent, a Knight of the Finnish Order of the Lion, Honorary Consul to Finland, sponsor of motorcycle trophies. In 1922, the Finnish government decorated him twice. He also had one problem he had not yet solved. His ships needed fuel. His customers' cars needed fuel. And in 1913, that problem walked in the front door. In 1913, a cargo of Californian motor spirit arrived in Melbourne, and the consignee could not pay the freight. Harold Sleigh sold it himself, and everything changed. Chapter 3. The cargo nobody paid for. Picture the moment. 1913. The wharf at Port Melbourne, a ship out of San Francisco carrying drums of refined Californian motor spirit, what Australians in 1913 still called benzene. The consignee had gone broke. The freight bill was not going to be paid. The ship's master went looking for a shipping merchant who could take the cargo off his hands. He found Harold Sleigh. Sleigh looked at the drums. He looked at the streets of Melbourne, where the number of motor cars was doubling every almost 18 months. He did the arithmetic in his head, bank clerk arithmetic, the same handwriting he had learned in Bristol 25 years earlier. He bought the cargo. He sold it. He made a profit. And then he did something that would define the next 100 years of Australian roadside history. He went and found more. In 1917, he registered a trademark. He chose the words carefully. The Order of the Golden Fleece had been created by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, in 1430, a chivalric order whose emblem was a gold sheep suspended by a cord around its ribs. The Argonauts had sailed for a golden fleece in Greek myth. Australia rode on the sheep's back. Every one of those layers mattered. He put them all in a single brand name, Golden Fleece, trademarked 1817. First curbside pump installed in South Melbourne in 1920. Park Street. A single hand-cranked Bowser and a hanging ram sign, painted gold. He also took up motorcycling personally at almost 50 years old. He sponsored the Victorian Motorcycle Club trophies. In 1923, he backed a record Adelaide to Sydney run, 1,280 miles in 40 hours and 9 minutes. The rider was carrying Golden Fleece fuel the whole way. The story ran in every metropolitan newspaper in the country the next morning. In 1926, he arranged for a live sheep to be painted gold tied with a blue ribbon and paraded around the Royal Melbourne Show. Sales tripled. He also, somewhere in this period, developed a mysterious affliction of his right foot. In 1926 he sailed to London to consult specialists. The treatment failed. His leg was amputated below the knee. In April 1933, at his home Laradoc, 111 Walsh Street, South Yarra, Harold Crofton Sleigh died of heart disease. He was 65 years old. His estate was probated at over £80,000. The sickly boy from Bristol, who had migrated to Australia for his health, had lived long enough to invent an industry. His only son inherited a shipping empire and a petrol brand that had no refinery of its own, a structural weakness that would take 50 years to kill it. Chapter 4. The Ram at Boonoke. Hamilton Morton. Howard Sleigh took the chair in 1933. He would hold it for 42 years, until 1975. He would be knighted in 1970 for services to Australian industry. The Australian financial press would call him the doyen of the petroleum industry. In 1947, Hamilton Sleigh took the company public, H.C. Sleigh Limited, listed on the Melbourne Stock Exchange with paid-up capital of £800,000. The petroleum arm was incorporated separately as Golden Fleece Petroleum Limited, funded initially by loans from Caltex, which were later converted into shares. That loan structure will matter later. Remember it. And in 1947, in a small office in Adelaide, 3 men sat down to design a new logo. Hamilton Sleigh. An enameller named Alfred Moxon Simpson, the same Simpson dynasty this channel has covered before, the family who built Australia's washing machine empire. And a 27-year-old signwriter named Arthur Robertson. Robertson worked in pencil on butcher's paper. He drew a merino ram in profile, standing proud, horns curled, chest deep. The model was a real animal, David of Dalkeith, Champion Pepin Merino, Boonoke Stud, near Dinnerliquin in the southern Riverina. The Falkiner family had paid a record price for him in 1927. Otway Falkiner had named the ram after his own racehorse. There is a story preserved by Arthur Robertson's sons, Wayne and William. Simpson and Robertson looked at the first sketch, and Simpson said the animal's testicles were too small, not proud enough, not Australian enough. Robertson enlarged them for the final design. In 1951, the golden ram went up on every golden fleece bowser in Australia. Enamel signs, illuminated globes, a 3-dimensional sculptural ram at the flagship stations, standardised paint scheme, standardised uniform for the driveway attendants. In 1957, the company began attaching restaurants to its service stations, full sit-down meals, 24 hours a day on every major highway in the country. Here's the number. According to Colin J. Dennett, the Australian petroleum historian, at its peak, H.C. Sleigh Limited operated approximately 5,000 service stations, roadhouses and distributors across Australia. Read that again. 5,000 outlets. By 1975, 140 of those roadhouses had restaurants attached, making Golden Fleece the largest fast food chain in Australia at that date, larger than any other food chain operating in this country in 1975. The ram was on every highway: the Hume, the Newell, the Sturt, the Bruce, the Stuart, the Great Western. In the outback, it was often the only sign of civilization between one town and the next. It was the last thing you saw before the desert started. By 1975, Sir Hamilton had built the largest petrol chain in the country and the largest restaurant chain in the country. And then he died, and his grandson took the chair. Chapter 5. The Cost of the Ram. Here's the thing about Golden Fleece that the collectors on Facebook do not always remember. Being a driveway attendant at a Golden Fleece station in the 1960s and 1970s was hot, tedious work. You stood in the sun, you cleaned windscreens, you checked oil, you pumped 4-star and super into cars whose drivers did not tip. You worked 6 days a week. You wore a peaked cap and a bow tie and a shirt with a golden ram embroidered on the chest pocket. The rural franchisees had it worse. They carried petrol stock on consignment, tyres they could not shift, batteries that sat in the sun for months and swelled and failed. Every capital city executive decision at Melbourne head office cost money to the man in Nangus, in Hay, in Ivanhoe, in Cobar. When crude prices moved, the franchisee absorbed it before the wholesale price schedule caught up. The workforce was migrant heavy. Greek families in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Italian families in the Riverina, Lebanese operators in Western Sydney. They worked 24-hour rosters. They lived above the servo. They raised their children behind the pumps. One of them was a young operator named Bill Whittaker. He started with Golden Fleece in 1973. He would stay until the very end. Whittaker later gave an interview to the trade magazine APMAG in June 2024. He described the culture, he described the pride, and he described, with almost forensic clarity, the one structural weakness that would eventually swallow the entire company. Golden Fleece had 5,000 outlets. Golden Fleece had 140 restaurants. Golden Fleece had tanker fleets, ocean terminals, distribution depots, a stock exchange listing and a family name over the door. But Golden Fleece did not have a refinery. Every barrel of crude oil the company ever sold was refined by somebody else. In the early years, it was the Vacuum Oil Company. From 1956 onwards, it was Caltex, at Colonel in southern Sydney. Caltex refined the crude and Golden Fleece bought the finished product wholesale and slapped the ram on the Bowser and sold it retail. Whittaker's exact words: "We were Caltex's biggest customer." Let that sentence sit for a moment. Australia's biggest homegrown petrol brand was structurally an intermediary, a very large, very profitable, very culturally beloved intermediary. But when the price of crude moved on the international market, Golden Fleece had no upstream to hedge with. It could only pass the pain to the franchisee, who passed it to the motorist. In 1975, Sir Hamilton Sleigh died. His grandson Peter took over, and 2 years later, the price of crude oil doubled again. Chapter 6: The country that could not refine its own fuel. But here's the problem. Australia in 1940 could build radar in secret in the basement of the Madsen building at Sydney University. Australia in 1942 could build a Sentinel cruiser tank at Chullora, an Owen submachine gun at Lysart Port Kembla, and a ferry battle bomber at International Harvester Geelong. Australia in 1949 could build the world's most powerful express steam locomotive at Clyde Engineering, Granville. Australia could not refine its own petrol. In 1940, the Menzies government established federal and state liquid fuel control boards. From August 1942 through April 1947, no competition between petrol brands was permitted in Australia. Pool Petroleum Proprietary Limited handled all fuel supply. Every Bowser in the country pumped the same generic wartime grade. The Golden Fleece ram came down for the duration. Rationing continued until February 1950, ended by Menzies only because the Commonwealth was running out of United States dollars to buy imported crude. Golden Fleece did contribute to the war effort. The company designed and sold gas producers, charcoal and wood gas units bolted to family cars, allowing Australians to keep driving on rationed fuel. It was ingenious. It was also an admission. The country could improvise around the shortage. It could not fix it. It did not build enough refineries. The Colonel refinery in southern Sydney was built by Caltex in 1956. American money, American engineering, American parent companies. Standard Oil of California, and the Texas Company. From then on, that refinery supplied the majority of the crude products sold under the Golden Fleece brand. Then came the shocks. On the 18th of July 1973, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam went on national television and announced a 25% across-the-board cut to Australian import tariffs, effective at midnight. The protective wall that had shielded Australian manufacturing since Federation came down in one broadcast. Tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs would be lost across the following decade. 3 months later, on the 16th of October 1973, the Organisation of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an oil embargo. The world crude price quadrupled in 5 months. The Iranian Revolution triggered a second oil shock in 1979. New South Wales introduced petrol rationing again. Odd-even number plate day at the pumps. Queues stretching around every service station block in Sydney. Golden Fleece watched crude quadruple. Golden Fleece watched Caltex, upstream at Colonel, adjust its wholesale prices to protect its own American parent. Golden Fleece had no refinery, no crude concession, no way to hedge, no way to survive the 1980s oil market. Bill Whittaker, again on the record, we watched the crude price go up and there was nothing we could do. And in March 1981, Peter Sleigh, the grandson of a sick boy from Bristol, signed his family's petrol empire away for $75 million. Chapter 7. The Handshake in Sydney. On the 16th of March 1981, the Canberra Times ran a headline on page 11. Caltex absorbs Golden Fleece. HC Sleigh Limited had announced the sale of its wholly owned subsidiary Golden Fleece Petroleum Limited to Caltex Oil, Australia. Proprietary Limited for a price reported at approximately 75 million Australian dollars. Over 200 retail outlets were included in the deal. The tanker fleet, the ocean terminals, the Golden Fleece trademark, the ram itself. The buyer was not really Australian. Caltex Oil Australia Proprietary Limited was the local operating arm of a joint venture between Standard Oil of California, today known as Chevron, and the Texas Company, known as Texaco. Both parents were headquartered in the United States. Both had shareholders in New York. The men who signed the contract on the buyer's side answered to boardrooms in San Francisco and Houston. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. Caltex Australia did not have all the cash on hand to pay for Golden Fleece. So in July 1981, 4 months after the acquisition, Caltex Australia floated 25% of its own shares to the Australian public on the Sydney Stock Exchange. It was the first time a foreign-owned oil multinational had done a public share float in Australia. Read that structure carefully. Australian mum and dad investors bought Caltex Australia shares. That money went into Caltex Australia's treasury. That treasury paid HC Sleigh Limited for Golden Fleece. Australian retail savings, funnelled through a Sydney stockbroker, purchased an Australian brand for an American multinational. Peter Sleigh's rationale was defensible. Golden Fleece had no refinery. It had no way to survive the crude price cycle of the coming decade. The alternative to selling was to watch the brand slowly bleed out over 5 or 10 years and be sold at the bottom of a distress cycle. He sold at the top. He got a good price. The Sleigh family walked away with capital and dignity. The residual HC Sleigh Limited did not, however, walk away clean. Within a few years, the company had merged with the Melbourne food group Petersville to become Petersville Sleigh, holder of 4 and 20 pies, Peter's Ice Cream, Edgelbird's Eye, Herbert Adams Pastries, and a suite of other Australian food brands. That entity was then targeted by John Spalvens, the Latvian-born managing director of the Adelaide Steamship Company, the same corporate raider who broke Peter's Ice Cream in the same decade. Adsteam absorbed Petersville Sleigh through a web of cross-holdings. In 1991, Pacific Dunlop bought Petersville Sleigh for $374 million. The food brands were then dispersed to Nestlé and to the American company J.R. Simplot. But the ram had already come down by then. Bill Whittaker walked into the office one morning in 1982. The sign painter was on the roof. He was painting over the ram. Chapter 8. The Ram Comes Down. Bill Whittaker, again in his own words to ACAP Mag in June 2024. When Caltex first bought Golden Fleece, they said they were going to run 2 brands, but that didn't last long, and less than a year later, they were phasing out the Golden Fleece brand. Less than a year. That is the timeline. The Australian Food Timeline Archive puts it the same way. The iconic Golden Ram sign gradually disappeared. Some franchisees refused to convert to Caltex branding. Jim Sonterre, the Petroliana researcher who runs gassigns.org, has documented the resistance. For them, it was Golden Fleece or nothing. Then the wider Australian petrol industry consolidated at speed. Caltex bought Total Australia in 1983. BP absorbed Amoco in 1984. Ampol bought Solo in 1988. Mobile bought Esso in 1990. In May 1995, Caltex and Ampol themselves merged. 6 brands became 3 inside 12 years. The service station count collapsed. Mark McKenzie, Chief Executive of the Australasian Convenience and Petroleum Marketers Association, has documented the number. Australia had approximately 28,000 service stations in the late 1970s. By 2008, that had fallen to 6,400. Today, it sits around 7,100. Almost 4 in every 5 Australian servers that existed in 1978 have simply vanished. In 1996, Caltex commissioned the American design agency Landor Associates to design a new corporate identity. New star logo, new colour scheme. The rollout reached Australia in February 1999. By then, the Golden Fleece Ram had been coming down, servo by servo, for 17 years. Some rams stayed up, not many. The former Golden Fleece station at Collector, on the old Federal Highway between Canberra and Goulburn, was bypassed by the highway in the mid-1990s and closed around 1997. The building shell remains. The former Golden Fleece station at Hartley, on the old Great Western Highway crossing the Blue Mountains, still carried faded ram signage when photographed in 2004. And on the Sturt Highway, about 24 kilometres west of Gundagai, in a town called Nangus, a Golden Fleece servo kept the enamel signage above its pumps, even after those pumps had been repainted for Caltex. Jim Sonterre photographed it in 2007. The lettering read, Golden Fleece Service. The pumps below it were pumping Caltex. In May 2020, Caltex Australia changed its name to Ampol. And somewhere in a legal registry in Sydney, the Golden Fleece trademark quietly changed hands one more time. Chapter 9. The Trademark in a Drawer. Here's the kicker. The company that today owns the Golden Fleece trademark is Ampol Limited, ASX code ALD, headquartered in Sydney. The path is convoluted, but the endpoint is real. In March 2015, Chevron sold its 50% stake in Caltex Australia to the Australian public. In 2019, Chevron, which globally owns the Caltex trademark, terminated its licence to Caltex Australia. At the May 2020 annual general meeting, Caltex Australia formally rebranded to Ampol Limited, reviving the name of the older Australian petrol company that Caltex had merged with in 1995. Every trademark previously held by Caltex Australia moved on to the Ampol Limited balance sheet, including the Golden Fleece trademark, first registered by Harold Sleigh in 1917. An Ampol spokesperson, questioned by ACAP Mag in 2024 about a possible revival. Golden Fleece holds iconic status as a brand and forms an important part of Ampol's storied history. Ampol always has ongoing conversations about its brands and their role in its wider portfolio. Translation: they own it. They will not bring it back. Colin J. Dennett, the petroleum historian, has been in dialogue with Ampol about a limited revival, perhaps as a heritage sub-brand, perhaps as a merchandise line. No concrete plan has been announced. The trademark sits in a drawer in Ampol's Sydney head office. It gets renewed every 10 years. Nobody uses it. The Kernell refinery, the American plant that Golden Fleece depended on, ceased refining in 2015. Caltex converted it into an import terminal. Today, Australia refines less than half of its own petrol demand. In the 1970s, at Golden Fleece's peak, that figure was over 90%. This country has systematically dismantled its refining capacity across 4 decades. The Kwinana refinery in Western Australia closed. The Altona refinery in Melbourne closed. The Bulwer Island refinery in Brisbane closed. Only Geelong and Lytton still operate as functioning refineries. The Founders Building at 166 to 172 Queen Street, Melbourne. The modernist HC Sleigh building, built between 1953 and 1955, is still standing. It was refurbished in 1991. The Melbourne City Council's Hoddle Grid Heritage Review notes its architectural significance. There is no plaque on the exterior mentioning the Sleigh family or the Ram. The building is a general office tower now. The Sleigh descendants are still alive. Peter Sleigh, the grandson who signed the 1981 contract, survives. The extended family is scattered across Melbourne and Victoria. Walk into any Australian country pub between Wagga and Griffith, and you will hear the same story. Not one of them says Golden Fleece anymore. Chapter 10. What the Rams are worth now. The collector market for Golden Fleece memorabilia is enormous. Original enamel signs from the 50s sell for between $500 and $5,000 at Burns & Company auctions in Brisbane. Complete illuminated ram globes, cracked and yellowed with age, have sold for over $10,000. A pristine, full-size sculptural ram of the sort that stood on the flagship stations would today command more than the original servo cost to build. The Powerhouse Museum in Sydney holds object 158,247. Golden Fleece Globe Light by H. Sleigh Limited. The catalogue description, written by curator Debbie Rudder in 2017, reads, "Plastic globe, formed in the shape of a merino ram, gold in Muller, dated approximately 1951 to 1980. It sits in storage. It is not currently on public display. The National Wool Museum in Geelong, at 26 Moorabool Street, holds a complete Golden Fleece petrol bowser with intact ram and hose. It was exhibited between July 2000 and February 2001 in a show called Logo Merino, Sheep in Australian Art and Design. The bowser sits in the permanent collection. At Camden in southwestern Sydney, the Camden Museum displays an internally illuminated golden ram globe donated in 2002 by a local named Milton Ray. Ray had operated the Golden Fleece Fuel Depot at the corner of Mitchell and Elizabeth Streets in Camden, with his father Les and his brother Pete since the 1950s. The ram had stood over their forecourt for 30 years. Bill Whittaker is still around. He gave the A Mag interview in June 2024. He remembers all of it: the pride, the pumps, the uniform with the ram on the pocket, the morning in 1982 when the sign painter was on the roof. The Golden Fleece Memories Facebook group has tens of thousands of members. Every day, Australians in their 50s and 60s and 70s post photographs of themselves as children, standing next to a Golden Fleece bowser. Their fathers, their grandfathers, the dog on the driveway, the Holden with the tow bar. In 1985, at Goulburn on the Hume Highway, the local Merino Country Cafe erected a 15-metre concrete merino statue and called it the Big Merino. Australians nicknamed it Rambo. It was, in its own way, the inheritor of the Ram. Built 4 years after Peter Sleigh signed the Caltex contract. The country had lost its national Petrol brand and reached instead for a 15-metre roadside sheep to remember it by. Drive west out of Gundagai on the Sturt Highway. About 24 kilometres in, you will pass through a town called Nangus, and if you know what to look for, you will see it. Chapter 11. The Ram at Nangus. Stand at the corner of the Sturt Highway and the old Nangus Service Road on an ordinary Thursday morning in 2026. The pumps are Caltex now, then Ampol, whatever the sticker says this week. But above the servo, in letters that never came down, the words still read, Golden Fleece Service. The Ram is gone from the roof. The lettering stayed. Lesson 1. A petrol brand. Without a refinery is a hostage. Harold Sleigh built a brand. He never built a refinery. Every barrel of crude golden fleece ever sold came out of somebody else's plant. The Vacuum Oil Company at first, then Caltex at Colonel from 1956 onwards. When the 1970s oil shocks hit, when crude quadrupled in 5 months, when the Whitlam tariff cut let foreign product flood every other Australian industry, Golden Fleece had no upstream to hedge with. It could only pass the pain to the franchisee, who passed it to the motorist, who eventually switched brands. Peter Sleigh sold in 1981 because he had no choice. The refinery his grandfather never built was the reason. Lesson 2. The Australian owner signed the papers. Caltex is the villain on the title card. That is fair. They bought the Ram and they took it down. But Peter Sleigh's signature is on the 1981 contract. He was the founder's grandson. He inherited the brand his grandfather registered in 1917, and he sold it. Every great Australian brand loss of the 20th century, Holden, Kraft, Speedo, Vegemite, Rosella, Aeroplane Jelly, Arnott's, 4 and 20, almost every one of them was signed away by an Australian at the top of the letterhead. The foreign buyer takes the blame in the folk memory. The Australian seller takes the cheque and buys a house in Toorak. Lesson 3. Ampol owns the trademark. Australia owns the memory. The Golden Fleece trademark is currently held by Ampol Limited. Ampol has said it always has ongoing conversations about its brands. Translation. They will not bring it back. The trademark sits in a drawer in a Sydney legal registry. The memory sits in a country pub in Nangus, in a Facebook group with tens of thousands of members, in a golden ram globe in the Powerhouse Museum, in a Bowser at the National Wool Museum in Geelong, in the 15-metre concrete merino at Goulburn. The company owns the paper. The country owns the Ram. Drive west out of Gundagai on a Thursday morning in 2026. About 24 kilometres in, you will pass through Nangus. Slow down at the old servo on the highway. Look above the pumps. The Ram is gone, but the words are still there, in the sun, in the wind. Golden Fleece Service. The pumps say Ampol now. The country that made the Ram is somewhere else.